Welcome to the program, everyone. I'm Christiane Amanpour in Washington at this hour, where crisis continues to disrupt the Trump administration. And if Democrats retake the House in November, buckle up for endless investigations and ever more bitter partisan fights. It is in this contentious atmosphere that I sat down with the presidential counselor, Kellyanne Conway. She's the most powerful woman in the White House and one of the few senior advisors still standing some 600 days into an administration of revolving doors. Conway is best known around the world for her combative defense of the president and for introducing the phrase alternative facts to the lexicon. But she has a major policy role as well, overseeing critical initiatives from the opioid epidemic ravaging this country to working with veterans and military spouses. Now, instead of getting into the ring with Conway, instead of debating and wrangling and wrestling, I really wanted to probe and get real answers and explore issues that her job is responsible for, including the relationship with the press. So we started by talking about the personal when we sat down in the Eisenhower Executive Office building next door to the White House. Kellyanne Conway, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Let me start by just digging a little bit into what it means to be the most powerful woman in the White House. That is who you are professionally, but personally, you're a wife, you're a mother of 4. How do you do it all? Are you living the I have a dream, have it all feminist ideal?
I think I'm living the feminist ideal without calling myself a feminist and without being anti-male.
That would be too radical.
Or pro-abortion, which it seems to be what some people think is the entry fee, the definition of being a feminist. I consider myself, Christiane, a product of my choices, not a victim of my circumstances. But in some ways, as blessed as I am and as fortunate as I've been in my life, thank God, my life is a very common experience. It's a very pedestrian, everyday example of the American dream come true, in that I was raised by a single mom. My father left when I was 3 years old, and we have a relationship now. He has a great relationship with me and my family, my children. But my mom figured it out in the 1970s with her high school degree, never expecting to go back into the workforce. And she just figured it out, as I think so many women have. I was raised in a house with my mom, her mom, and 2 of my mother's unmarried sisters. So these 4 Catholic Italian women raised me in a small house in South Jersey between Philadelphia and Atlantic City. Never had a single political conversation that I can remember. We had pictures of the Last Supper and the Pope on the wall, not of John Kennedy or Ronald Reagan.
I just want to ask you, how did what you describe as your circumstances affect you and shape the way you are as a woman, as a professional woman? I mean, did you face obstacles climbing the proverbial professional ladder? You're a successful political consultant, you've done books, you're on television, you're now the senior counsel to the White House, to the president. Did you have to face your own misogyny moments, your own sexism, the obstacles and adversity?
Yes, actually, but I didn't let it define me, and I didn't let it stop me. I let it help me to shape me and to help me grow and know who I am. I'm self-deprecating, I'm self-aware. I know what all my weaknesses are. I didn't need men to point them out for me, although many tried along the way and failed. But remember, too, I was in political polling. I was in polling, corporate and political polling in the Republican Party. In some ways, at a microcosmatic level, that's like being in an Elks Club meeting in a locker room on a golf course. You know, it's very, very male-dominated, male-centric. And there were many times, Christiane, as you can imagine, even when I had my own company and I was a paid political analyst on CNN 22 years ago when there were very few of them. They gave me my first shot on TV. Even then, it would be, let's let the girls do the focus groups, the men will do the polling, which, looking back, only meant, let's put her on the airplane for 3 days away from home and I'll sit here on my behind in Washington and look over the numbers. But that's okay, because I got on the plane when they say, how's it playing in Peoria? What's going on in Lubbock? I got on the plane and I talked to the people in Peoria and Lubbock, and I worked literally, physically in all 50 states. So I've had such a privilege for decades now of literally going out and talking to Americans. And that helped me when Donald Trump on August 12th, privately, it was announced 5 days later, asked me to be his campaign manager, August 12th, 2016. One of the things I had seen in his rise, vanquishing 16 or 17 other qualified men and women in the Republican side, is that he had a connective tissue with Americans, and I had heard so much of that in focus groups and in open-ended questions over the years in the polling, that he was connecting with them. They did feel invisible. They did feel left behind. They felt forgotten.
Kellyanne, obviously, you work for the president. You're a senior counselor. You're a true believer. I wonder how you've been affected then by the storm of new, writings, books, Bob Woodward, the op-ed in the New York Times. Do you feel under a sort of sense of siege at the White House?
No.
Or do you feel sort of relief that maybe some of this is out in the open and you continue serving the president, and as these people seem to say, also try to, put a break on some of the quote-unquote whims?
I feel neither of those, Christiana. I'm glad you asked. I guess my first feeling would be disappointment. And it's disappointment in whomever has authored this op-ed. It's ironic because come forward. Because I think it's pathetic, not patriotic, that you would hide behind anonymous. For what reason? The New York Times said they granted anonymity to protect that person from losing his or her job. That's odd. Because
do you think that person is inside the White House?
Most of us don't think that. The president just today said he believes it's somebody in national security. But what I do believe is that who has said that ought to come forward and say it, or ought to resign, because the loyalty is not to the president only or at all. It's loyalty to the presidency. It's loyalty to the Constitution. It's loyalty to serving in an administration that has views on issues, wants certain positions to fail and others to prevail. So I didn't work in President Obama's administration. I didn't work in President George W. Bush's administration. People who did, I would think, although they all didn't, anonymously or otherwise, believe in what was happening there at the time. And so the disappointment I really feel is for the 62 million Americans who voted for President Trump and the over 300 million whom he governs, 330 million or so whom he governs as president.
So what do you think then of President Trump saying that the New York Times should hand over this person to the government, of Senator Rand Paul, who's a big advocate of the president, saying there should be a lie detector test inside the White House or inside the administration to try to ferret this writer out? Is there, and others have said there's, a hunt for the so-called culprit. Is that happening in the White House or in the administration?
I'd much rather see an investigation of all the high-ranking people at the FBI who were trying to fix an election for the loser.
This one.
I'm not interested in the investigation of this. I guess those who are investigating, great. I really hope they find the person. I believe the person will suss himself or herself out, though, because that's usually what happens. People brag to the wrong person. They brag that they did this or they did that because I assume part of this, isn't the goal here not what the op-ed pretends the goal is, Christiane? Isn't the goal here really to try to sow chaos and get us all suspicious of each other and take the president off his game?
Are you all getting suspicious of each other?
No, that isn't what happens. It never happens. What happened at the beginning of this week when Bob Woodward's book came out, and then the anonymous op-ed came, and this happened and that happened. And if you go back and look on Twitter, it's embarrassing, but what isn't, for many, not all, not even most in the press corps. So many people, I screenshotted them for my own amusement. You ask how I'm so happy. So many people. By the end of this week, there will be a massive purge. There'll be an exodus. People will leave. How many times have we heard this? They don't. What worries me is that people who have the privilege of being in the media industry, or really just being in almost any industry, but covering the White House, don't still understand how Donald Trump got elected and why, and they still not understanding who elected him and what they heard from his message and how they contrasted that to the loser's message and wanted what he ran on to prevail.
So let me ask you, because it's obviously clear that we have to get to this point, and that is this, I don't know what to call it, distrustful, dysfunctional, really, destructive relationship between the presidency and the press at the moment. I wonder whether there's a way to get out of it. And I'm really interested in exploring it because it is the pillar of democracy. I mean, the Fourth Estate is a vital pillar of our democracy and civil society. You yourself, I don't believe, thinks that we, the press, are the enemy of the people. Do you believe that?
I've said that, no.
You don't believe that? Then do you try to weigh in with the president on this issue? Of course, he has his views and he makes it clear all the time. But you know that a month ago, there were some 300 US newspapers that tried to, gather the group to defend the press themselves against this enemy of the people slogan. And shortly afterwards, there was the arrest of a man in California who had taken this to heart, who had threatened to shoot Boston Globe reporters in the head. I mean, at what point is there a red line for you personally in the rhetoric causing potential danger and having consequences?
Okay, well, there's a lot in your extended statement, so let me just say this. I don't think the press writ large is the enemy of the people. I do find the press often in their coverage of this White House and this administration and this president to be the enemy of the relevant, to be the enemy of what Americans are telling the press in the press's own polling is relevant to them. They don't cover what's in their own polling. So a major outlet will do a poll and it'll ask Americans, what's the most important issue to you? And let's just say in some fashion, the top 3 or 4 issues are the economy and jobs, healthcare, immigration, foreign policy, education. They don't cover those issues day after day. And they'll say, yes, we do, and they don't. If you do a content analysis, they simply don't. They want to cover the messenger, not the message. They want to cover palace intrigue and personnel and not principles and policies, which is what people around kitchen tables are talking about. Now,
to an extent.
It's going to be a little tough for me, and I would think some of my colleagues here who have been forced to have either Secret Service protection or security and really just change some of our lifestyles at times. It's going to be a hard thing for me to swallow that the only people under threat or under assault are reporters at this newspaper or this person. If certain reporters feel that way, why do they go on late night TV? Why do they have agents they pay a percentage to? Why do they write books? Why do they give speeches for tons of money? Probably 2 speeches what I'll make in the White House in a year. So many people want themselves to be public figures.
I'm not entirely sure of the logic, but
I think people watching will be, not the press.
Right, but no, look, I'm serious about trying to figure this out because I've put my life on the line most of my career to tell the truth. Tell the truth. And I just wonder whether, again, you feel that there's a potential consequence. I understand that there's some hate.
It goes both ways.
There's some hate groups directed towards some of you in the White House. However, there are also all sorts of despicable and undemocratic leaders all over the world
Been around forever.
who are taking seriously President Trump's permission to demonize their own press, not to mention us, but to demonize their own press, to put them in jail, to often do worse to them.
Christiane, that didn't happen in the last 20 months, as you full well know.
No, but I do also know that
you're actually an award-winning journalist who's gone around the globe.
But it has got worse in the last few months. And people are using the fake news slogan to justify the unprecedented amount of imprisonment and violence directed towards journalists around the world. I see things every single day that are just not true. People will call, I'm not even in the press and comm shop, and people will call me and ask a question. I'll say, that's not true. People will actually do a story about my state of mind. And I'll say, but that's not true. And they'll write it in. Well, we have 2 sources who aren't me about what I think. But do you accept what I just posited?
What I want to tell you is, I truly feel for your generation and your elevation of journalists, because the media writ large now does not include a lot of Christiane Amanpours. It includes a lot of people who call themselves reporters because they sit on Twitter all day seeing who wrote what, and then they repeat it even though they don't independently research it themselves.
But the president accuses people from established high-level media organizations, including the New York Times, CNN. It's not just the Twitterati.
But he sees things that aren't true. Christiane, I assure you, I work here. And I work here because I want to be one small molecule for change in the country I love so deeply that has given me and my family so much, including freedom and the ability for my 3 daughters to go to school where girls in some places in the world can't. I can drive. I can go to college and law school as the first person in my family. A lot of women can't around the globe. You know that more than anybody. And so for me, who's doing that kind of reporting? We see things every single day on TV and in print that I promise you, I swear to God, are patently false. And nobody calls, or they don't believe when we tell them what the truth is. And my main grievance has always been simple. I said it during the campaign. I said it during the transition when I also said, look, the president and the media are going to share joint custody of the country for the next 4 or 8 years. I'll say 8 years now. We have to figure out a way to responsibly co-parent, as they say in modern language. And that goes both ways. But what I've always said, Christiana, I'll continue to say, is it's not just biased coverage. That's easy to detect. If you want to find biased coverage in this, or I want to find bias and coverage in that, you'll find it. It's incomplete coverage. It's that the administration and the media have 2 independent but consequential platforms by which to inform the American people, if not the world, to your point, of what's actually happening here. The economic numbers are the story the greatest story never told. What the president is making good on his promises with respect to trade and manufacturing, construction. If you're a coal miner, if you're in construction, if you're in manufacturing, if you want to be in a vocational trade, this is your president. That story is not getting out there because it's not as riveting. And you know what? A lot of policy is tough to figure out.
A lot of policy is tough to figure out.
There are some journalists who are liberal. There are some who are just lazy, and they don't want to figure out.
And there are some who are good at what they do.
Present company expect that's right. That's why I said I feel for a certain generation elevation of journalists, because people, even the most virulently anti-Trump editors, will not allow certain things in their paper if they can't check them for veracity, right? Even if they'd like to, they won't do it. But the same reporters who can't get away with doing it there get away with it through their cable news contracts, get away with it on social media.
As you know, at our cable news organization, if there is a mistake, we apologize, correct, and move on very rapidly and very transparently. Sometimes. We do. What I want to know, though, is do you think the president might take a stance of his own to pull back from this? Because remember what he told Leslie Stahl right after his inauguration, after his election, even before he was inaugurated. He basically said, when she asked him about this, you know why I do it. I do it to discredit you all and demean you all so that when you write negative stories about me, no one will believe you. So, is this a long-lasting strategy, or can we see potentially some way to get out of this thing that doesn't seem to be good for you or for us?
I'll respond in a few ways. First of all, I do agree that it's not healthy for the body politic on either side. There's no indication we have, and someone like I and others have tried, the president has tried, to turn down the temperature, to give more access. He just gave a few major interviews to print outlets. He gives interviews on television. But when you see story after story, when you hear all the good news not being covered, I want to give you a great example. We talked about the economic reports. I think the media will start covering the economy if it ever goes down. I think they'll start covering the regulation if it ever starts going up again. And I want to say, if this country doesn't know what fentanyl is, then the media are falling down on their job.
Okay, I want to ask you about that.
30,000 Americans died from it last year. And if you're not talking about that, if you're talking about anonymous, fentanyl's not anonymous. My goal is to make sure the 30,000 Americans who died from a fentanyl overdose last year aren't anonymous.
And this is your big issue in the White House, one of the big ones, the opioid crisis. Do you have personal experience that leads you, like so many Americans and so many politicians? Do you know people who have suffered from this? Do you have anybody in your family? Is it close to you?
I do, but again, I think that makes me like everybody else. It gives me the connective tissue with the rest of the country. I do, and I think everyone does. The president went first here, Christiane. He said, my brother, Fred Jr., died of alcoholism at the age of 42. And he will say, he said it again recently, I think the pool spray was there. press pool was there, he said, my brother was so handsome, he was so smart, he was the oldest, and it just ruined his life and eventually took his life. So he went first in sharing his story. Here at the White House, we have a website, and it's Share Your Story, crisisnextdoor.gov, because we want everybody to know the stigma and the silence that attends to addiction in any form, but particularly opioid and drug addiction, needs to be blown away, that people feel like they can come to somebody in their circle of life and share that story. I have experience with the Me Too movement. Long before there was a Me Too movement, I was put upon, I was victimized, but nobody cares because I work for President Trump.
No, people care.
Oh, I don't know. I said it after the same. It doesn't matter to me. It doesn't matter to me now. But I just want to say I'm 51 years old, so you can imagine. When this was, I think, acceptable and much more commonplace behavior.
What happened to you?
Nobody had cell phones. I want to say this, that I said that for the first time after the debate in St. Louis, which was 2 days after the Access Hollywood tape came out, and President Trump and Hillary Clinton debated. And afterwards, I said it on live TV. And they said, well, here's a list of people who think Donald Trump should get out of the race, and Republican members of Congress. And I looked at the list and I said, fascinating. I hadn't thought about a few of them in a while. But when I see their names, I'm reminded that they were early disciples of the Me Too movement. It wasn't called the Me Too movement at the time. But that is, I think, what's changed for women, and what I'm really proud of with President Trump is I was in Republican polling and politics, and I had a successful business for decades. But it's he who elevated a woman. I was hiding in plain sight to his campaign manager. It's he who has a female press secretary. President Obama had 4 press secretaries, never a female. He had 2 or 3 campaign managers, never a female.
But he had a top council advisor who was a female.
That's fine. I have her office, Valerie Jarrett. She's
go.
lovely, and she was great to me when we first got here and showing me the ropes.
Let me just ask you a bit more about the opioids, because, you know, Congress has attributed something like $5 billion. Some are saying 6 now. Good. Some are saying that it needs about 10 times that amount, and that a lot more emphasis needs to be on prevention and against harm and treatment rather than law enforcement. Do you agree with that?
So I agree that there is a 3-front war on the opioid drug demand, drug supply crisis. And when the president gave his remarks in his policy rollout on March 19th in New Hampshire, he said exactly that. We need to tackle these simultaneously, not sequentially, because they're all important. Treatment and recovery, prevention and education, law enforcement and interdiction. You cannot arrest or punish your way out of a drug crisis that is roiling every demographic and geographic group. It knows no boundaries. It discriminates against no one. And what the president has done, I'll quickly run through them. What the president has done is he secured $6 billion in new funding from Congress. Now, through the $4 billion came through the spending bill, of which not a single Democrat voted for. So I would ask those Democrats who say we need 10 times $6 billion, why'd you vote against the first $6 billion? I am happy to tell you that H.R. 6, the largest legislative package in our nation's history on any one drug crisis at any one time, that passed the House, Christiane, 396 to 14. Nothing passes the House 396 to 14. So there's great bipartisanship in the effort to solve. It's now in the Senate. We want it on the president's desk so he can sign it and tell the country what's in it. So prevention also means, and education also means, of prescribers, of drug companies, because we're now seeing 30 pills in a bottle go down to 5 or 7. And I want to make very clear to your audience that we're not talking about chronic pain survivors, chronic pain Americans who suffer from chronic pain and need pain medication, like my own mother. We're talking about the collegiate or high school sports injury. We're talking about the dental procedure, the surgery, where you go home with these bottles of pills. And that's when the trouble begins. Opioids is tricky. So we're trying to educate everyone. Opioids is tricky because that tiny little bottle bears a label that says family doctor and local pharmacy. And it's been legally prescribed, so it's meant to help someone somehow. And you think just trying one won't hurt you, and it's becoming a gateway for other problems. And education is also prescriber education. These are addictive. They are mind-scrambling. NIH is working on a non-addictive solution. Also, the Surgeon General put out the first advisory for a Surgeon General in about a dozen years, and it was about naloxone. This is the overdose reversing drug. He wants more Americans to be able to carry it around like you would an EpiPen.
I just want to get back to, from where I sit, usually reporting from Europe and around the world, some of the stuff that's come out in the Bob Woodward book and in previous accounts of this White House and this presidency, people are kind of concerned. They don't know how to adjust and adapt for the Trump factor. They see him sometimes denigrating and pouring cold water over global alliances and the hard work of diplomacy and negotiations, and tending to cozy up, that's my word, to more traditional adversaries. Then they also see, well, the president may say something and tweet something, but the government, the administration, Congress, are actually taking traditional foreign policy, positions. Do you buy that? I mean, is this administration doing traditional foreign policy while President Trump nonetheless says what he wants to say about things and responds to various allies and adversaries in that way?
Well, as Secretary in General Jim Mattis said earlier this week in response to the book, that the idea that he would disparage the, and this is a key phrase, elected commander, or tolerate anybody else doing that, that is the way many people view this president or any president. He is the elected commander-in-chief. He has a certain view of foreign policy. He thinks this country had been taken advantage for many, many years. He has said it many times. He said it many times on the campaign, so it helped him get elected, where he says we're getting taken advantage of. He's taken us out of the Iran deal. He kept the promise of five presidents, to move the U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem and to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, as Israelis do. He pulled us out of the Paris Accords, and everybody said the same thing every single time, didn't they? Oh my God, the whole world's going to fall apart. Our faces will melt off tomorrow.
You know, people are still saying that overseas, well, by the way.
Of course they're going
but
to
let's talk about Vladimir Putin specifically.
Okay, but if
he praises him, and yet your administration and Congress keep up with the fairly tough...
He sanctions him, though. No, but it's him too.
Yeah.
He sanctions. It's not the same administration. No, I'm sorry. I have to push back on that. This president has called for the Department of Treasury, has called for Congress and others in a position to look at the sanctioning. He has sanctioned and expelled Russians from this country. It's not that he's cozying up. I'm actually offended by the term, the verb, to Vladimir Putin. It's that the president is doing what he always said he'd do, which is if he can join together with other major countries and leaders to work on the big issues on which we agree, he will do that. And so in this case, it may be Syria. It may be North Korea. When he met with Vladimir Putin, they discussed the Middle East. They discussed Syria and North Korea. If just this week, it didn't get a lot of coverage because Kim Jong-un, I guess, is not anonymous, but it's a major thing that Secretary Pompeo is continuing these talks to follow up on the Singapore meeting, and that Kim Jong-un has said he wants to denuclearize, and that they're taking steps that way. We're already ahead of the game that way, Christian, because the vice president went to Hawaii and received the remains of our brave men and women in battle from North Korea. The 3 detainees are back here on American soil with their families. So this is a president who has said he is open if the conditions are right and they continue to not put America last or even second, to meet with different leaders. But let's be fair about all the trips he's had, all the bilateral meetings he's hosted here at the White House, all of the multilateral meetings that he has attended. His first trip in May of 2017 was, the very first stop was to the seat of the Muslim world. He went to Saudi Arabia, then he went to the Vatican, then he went to Israel the same trip. And that just should show the entire world that he is serious about bringing peace, not war, anywhere that he, as the commander-in-chief at a time such as this, the American president, can do so. But he also thinks that we're getting screwed on our trade deals, and he's very honest about that. He's renegotiating NAFTA with Mexico and then with Canada, and he thinks that our trade policy is part of our security policy. You can't have national security without economic security, and vice versa. And NAFTA is 24 years old. He thinks it's very unfair to our workers. He thinks it's unfair to our interests, and that it needs to be modernized and more reciprocal and equitable to Americans. A lot of Americans agree.
And we will take that up with one of the leaders of the global financial community,
yes.
Christine Lagarde. Kellyanne Conway, thank you so much for joining us.
Appreciate it. Thank you.